In March of 2019, the assumed head of the Gambino crime family, Francesco Frank or Frankie Boy Cali, was shot to death outside his Staten Island home. The immediate assumption is that it was a mob hit, one that a retired FBI agent described as what would have been the first rub out of a made Gambino man in decades. But when the suspect was arrested, it appears that the hit had nothing to do with the mob and was actually a crime of passion. The newspapers have speculated that the young man who shot Cali was upset that Cali wasn't letting him date his niece. But Cali was not the first head of the Gambino family to meet a violent end, and his death did bring to mind the last time that happened. The 1985 murder of Constantine Big Paul Castellano is a quintessential example of the violence that has been associated with organized crimes, been attributed to John the Teflon Don Gotti. The Gambino family is one of the 5 families of mafia infamy, and they have a long and storied history that includes many times when the boss met an untimely end. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The organized criminal group that was called the Mafia by the American press originated out of poverty-stricken immigrant communities in some of the nation's largest cities. New York City and New Orleans saw the beginnings of what would become the Mafia starting as early as the mid-1800s. Those involved in the business never called themselves Mafia, but referred to the group as Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing. At their peak, there were at least 26 cities around the United States with Cosa Nostra families. Their activities included profit-making enterprises like labor and construction racketeering, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, money laundering, hijacking, prostitution, fraud, and fencing. Some of the group also took part in drug traffic, but others believed that that type of business was too dangerous because it draws too much attention from the authorities. The Black Hand, a type of extortion method used in Italian communities in New York City near the turn of the last century, has been credited by some historians as the start of the Mafia, but others disagree with that designation. The Black Hand were small cells or gangs operating independently, were investigated notably by New York City policeman Joseph Petrosino and others for their possible connections to the Italian Mafia. The later American Mafia that would find its legs during Prohibition was much more organized. Bosses or capos ran groups called families and passed orders down to soldiers or mobsters at the lower levels. If arrested for criminal activities, the unspoken code of the Mafia is to never give up information or to turn on their associates or family. It harkens back to the Italian code of omerta, translated literally to be manhood, and the idea that a real man does not need police or lawmakers to deal with his problems. He handles them on his own or with family and close friends. The Gambino crime family was one of the 5 families to emerge after the Castellammarese War, an all-out battle between mob bosses for control of the American Mafia that occurred in the early 1930s. The first Gambino family leader was Salvatore Toto d'Aquila, a Sicilian immigrant who was the head of the most powerful mafia group in New York City when he was gunned down while walking down the street in Manhattan on October 10, 1928. The hit was supposedly ordered by one of d'Aquila's rivals, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, a young Carlo Gambino who had been employed by d'Aquila, now operated under the banner of Masseria, until Masseria was, in turn, killed in a restaurant in 1931. The back-and-forth assassinations between the families continued until, at the conclusion of the Castellammarese Wars, the mob formed the commission of the heads of the 5 most powerful crime families. It was sort of an executive board, and while the commission reduced the need to fight over control of the mob, it did not prevent squabbles from occurring within the families themselves. What would become the Gambino family was first led by Vincent Mangiano, who mysteriously disappeared in April 1951. His disappearance was laid at the feet of his underboss, Albert Anastasia. Anastasia, also called the Lord High Executioner in certain circles, was a notorious hitman and leader of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the Mafia, which has been credited with almost 1,000 murders. Carlo Gambino became Anastasia's consigliere, or the person Anastasia went to for advice on the family business. Anastasia's propensity for violence, he had a tendency to strike out against those for whom he bore a grudge or who he had thought had spoken to authorities, alienated him from other mobsters, which likely led to his assassination in a barber chair on October 25, 1957 in the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. Carlo Gambino, the man who would give the family its name, now took the reins of power, with most insiders assuming that he had ordered the hit on Anastasia. Gambino was born on October 24th, 1902 in Palermo, Sicily, to a family involved with the Sicilian mafia. He immigrated to the United States on December 23, 1921 by sneaking into Norfolk, Virginia on the ship SS Vincenzo Florio. Later, he said he only ate anchovies and drank wine on his trip across the ocean, which he made alone. Gambino became a teenage hitman for the American Mafia and was made at just the age of 19. He made money running liquor during Prohibition and selling ration coupons on the black market during World War II. He also took a cut of Meyer Lansky's, a Jewish mafioso's gambling houses in Cuba and the Bahamas. The only time Gambino spent in federal prison was in the 1930s, when he was found guilty of running a legal liquor still. Gambino was known for his welcoming smile, which he used to put those around him at ease, sometimes to their own peril. He became the unofficial chairman of the commission after bringing together many of the other mafia bosses and expanding their reach into unclaimed territory by building bridges and forging business relationships between rival groups. Gambino was considered by many to be Mario Puzo's muse for the character of Don Vito Corleone in his magnum opus, The Godfather. He strongly discouraged drug trafficking by his family and associates, with the unofficial policy being deal and die. But his other businesses were thriving. In the 1960s, historians estimate that his family's business was bringing in more than $500 million a year through its illegal activities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began to monitor Gambino's home in the 1970s and beyond. They used wiretaps, video surveillance, and lip reading in an effort to connect the mob boss to criminal activities. Gambino developed a highly complex system of hand signs and codes to continue communicating with his associates, while giving the FBI nothing to incriminate him. For example, the Bureau reported a meeting where one of the mobsters visiting Gambino said, "frog legs," and in response, Gambino simply nodded. Though the feds indicted Gambino for masterminding a burglary ring in 1970, they were unable to make the charges stick. Gambino was unconcerned by their efforts. He was known to offer the federal agents refreshments in his home before they took him downtown for booking. Then in 1972, Gambino's nephew, Emmanuel Manny Gambino, was kidnapped by James Jimmy from Queens McBratney and his Irish mob. They demanded a ransom of $350,000 for a safe return. This particular group had been kidnapping and ransoming Italian mobsters for a year without suffering the consequences. Gambino came back with a counteroffer, $60,000 for his nephew. This was apparently unacceptable to the kidnappers. When Manny Gambino's body was found in a New Jersey dump, Gambino struck back. He called upon John Gotti, one of his family's associates, for revenge. Gotti and a few of his friends tracked down McBratney in a Staten Island tavern in May 1973 and killed him. Gotti spent time in prison for the crime. Gambino went on to die of heart troubles in his bed in Massapequa, New York. He was 74 years old. Despite whatever violence he caused or came from his orders, one of Gambino's last actions in his life was to watch the New York Yankees win the 1976 American League Championship. Before his death, Gambino put his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, in charge of the Gambino family, instead of his assumed heir, Gambino's underboss, Agnello the Tall Guy Della Croce. This surprise decision is eventually what led to the rise of John Gotti. Gotti was born in the South Bronx and was the fifth of his family's 13 children. He began running with gangs early, dropping out of school at the age of 16. For a time, Gotti held low-paying jobs, for example as a coat presser, but the mafia represented a more lucrative career path. In 1968, Gotti spent 3 years in prison for the crime of stealing cargo from JFK Airport, and then in 1972 he spent 2 more years in prison for the murder of James McBratney. Not everyone in the family agreed with Carlo Gambino's decision to give the power to Castellano over Della Croce. When some of Gotti's men were busted for trafficking in drugs, he allegedly made the unpopular decision to knock off Castellano and take the reins of power for himself. In a way, Gotti may have considered the power grab to be self-defense, with the Gambino family's policy of deal and die. On December 16, 1985, as Castellano was getting out of his car in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, 3 gunmen walked through the Christmas shopping crowd and began shooting. Castellano, age 70, and his lieutenant, Thomas Bellotti, were both killed. It was the last time a mob hit had been completed in such a public manner until Frank Callie's murder this year. A few days later, FBI informants saw Gotti being embraced and congratulated by his associates outside the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's headquarters in Manhattan's Little Italy. The building still stands, but is now a shoe store. He began, by mobster standards, a rather showy lifestyle, allowing reporters to take his picture and dressing in fine suits. They called him the Dapper Don. Then, when Gotti dodged racketeering charges in the 1980s, he acquired another nickname, the Teflon Don, because he bragged federal charges couldn't stick to him. When Gotti stood trial for shooting a union leader, he told reporters, "I give you 3-to-1 odds I beat this case." And he did. But Gotti's fortune seemed to turn when the FBI caught him on tape at the Ravenite Social Club criticizing his lieutenant, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gravano heard the tapes and decided to work with the FBI to protect himself from Gotti. In court, Gravano testified that not only was Gotti the head of the Gambino family, but also that Gotti had ordered the slaying of Castellano. It was a shining moment for the authorities, as at that time, Gravano was the highest-ranking mobster to agree to testify in court. On the strength of Gravano's testimony and other evidence, Gotti was sentenced to life in prison. Gotti didn't believe his luck had ended, even then. He said, "It's all right, it's not over yet." When he was visited by friends in prison in 1998, Gotti's spirits were still high. He said, "Listen to me carefully. You'll never see another guy like me if you live to be 5,000. But Gotti's career was indeed over. He died of cancer in prison in June 2002. Unlike Carlo Gambino, John Gotti died in a prison bed instead of his own home. He was perhaps expressing regret in his life when he said, "Maybe I flatter myself. Maybe me and a lot of other people think I am more important than I really am." But in a court appearance, he told a reporter, "My life dictated each course I took. I didn't have any multiple choice." Still, Gotti's style could not have contrasted more with the man who gave the Gambino family its name, and it's hard not to think that that played some role in their contrasting fate. There is a reason that John Gotti was called the Teflon Don, while Carlo Gambino was called the Godfather. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.